Alara, tears streaming down her face, looked at the judge and said, "I believe you need to see more than what you've seen so far." Alara Monroe stood in the courtroom, her eyes locked onto the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. She was not just fighting for her son's freedom, but for the truth to break through the suffocating weight of injustice that had trapped him. The room was thick with tension, a mixture of stale air and uncertainty, the shadows from the tall windows stretching long across the polished wooden floor. Judge Lorne Draycott sat high above them, his eyes cold and dismissive. He had seen cases like this before, cases where the truth was buried beneath layers of doubt and prejudice. To him, it was just another day, another case. But to Alara, this was everything. Her son, Cairo Monroe, stood beside her, his young face pale but resolute. He had spent weeks locked away, his future slipping further from his grasp with each passing day. The prosecutor, Cyrus Vane, leaned back in his chair, his expression one of utter confidence. He had already decided Cairo was guilty, even before the trial had begun. It wasn't about the truth. It was about securing his own rise in the world. Alara's heart clenched as she watched him, his self-assured smile making her blood boil. "Your Honor, please." Alara's voice cracked, but she steadied herself, desperation giving her strength. "Just look at the evidence. My son is innocent." A low murmur spread through the courtroom, and Judge Draycott barely glanced at her, his eyes cold and uninterested. "Miss Monroe, this court has already reviewed the evidence," he said dismissively. "You need to accept the reality of the situation." The words stung. Reality was that her son had been accused based on a lie, a false witness who couldn't even remember what they'd seen. Reality was that the prosecution had manipulated the facts, twisting the truth to fit their narrative. And yet, despite a clear alibi, despite the holes in their case, no one seemed to care. "I have new evidence," Alara pressed, her voice shaking with the weight of it all. "Please, just look at it." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Monroe, we do not have time for last-minute evidence." He turned his gaze back to the prosecutor as if to dismiss her entirely. But something shifted in the room. A voice, steady and calm, interrupted the tension. "Wait." Every head turned. The sudden interruption caught everyone off guard. Alara's pulse quickened. This was the moment. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of uncertainty settling in the room like a heavy fog. Even Judge Draycott seemed to hesitate for the first time. Alara had pushed forward, holding the small flash drive in her hands. It was her final hope, the piece of evidence that could prove Cairo's innocence beyond any doubt. She plugged it into the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered to life, but before the video could load, the judge let out a long sigh. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice laced with impatience, "this is not the time for distractions. This footage is irrelevant." The prosecutor, Cyrus Vane, shot her a smug look, leaning back in his chair, confident that his victory was assured. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to derail the case," he sneered. "We've already established the facts." But Alara wasn't deterred. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I have security footage," she said, holding up the flash drive once again. "It proves my son wasn't anywhere near the scene of the crime." For the first time, the judge hesitated, his stern expression faltering. He turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Vane, do you have any objections?" Cyrus Vane's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "This footage could easily be fabricated. It's meaningless." But Alara, her heart pounding, didn't back down. "You knew he was innocent from the start. You didn't care to look because it didn't fit your narrative," she shot back, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The screen flickered again, and this time it began to show the footage. The timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen, 8:43 p.m., the exact time of the crime. And there, walking out of the store, was Cairo. He had been miles away from the scene, completely innocent. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid, began to crumble before their eyes. Even the jury, who had been silent and indifferent up until now, leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide in shock. Alara held her breath, waiting for the judge's next move. Would he finally see the truth, or would he try to bury it once again? The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the projector. Judge Draycott's grip on his gavel tightened. He looked between the screen and Cairo's face, frozen in time. For the first time, doubt flashed across his features. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable. And then, it happened. The prosecutor, his face pale, his jaw clenched, tried to regain control. "This proves nothing," he muttered, his voice breaking. The footage could have been tampered with, but the damage had already been done. The truth was undeniable. "Your Honor," Alara said, her voice firm now, "you know this is real. You know my son is innocent." The room erupted into chaos as the weight of the evidence hit everyone. Alara had done it. She had forced them to see the truth. Alara Monroe didn't speak. She didn't need to. The courtroom was already holding its breath. Cyrus Vane, the prosecutor who had once stood so confidently, opened his mouth, but no words came out. His smug composure had drained from his face. Alara turned her gaze slowly toward Judge Lorne Draycott. For a long moment, he said nothing. He had been silent through it all. Silent when Alara begged to be heard. Silent when the system tried to crush her beneath its gavel. The gavel now lay still on his bench, untouched. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale as he stared at the monitor that had just played the surveillance footage. Footage that revealed Cairo Monroe could not have been at the scene. That arrogance, that dismissiveness in his voice every time she stood to speak, it had evaporated. For the first time, he didn't see her as just an emotional mother. He saw her, a woman who had screamed into the void and had, against all odds, been heard. A crack appeared in Judge Draycott's stern facade. Shame, regret. He was no longer the unshakable figure cloaked in law. He was simply a man who had failed to listen. The silence in the courtroom deepened, stretching thinner with every passing second. Then, finally, he drew in a shaky breath. "This evidence," he said, his voice lower than before, "demands a full review." Gasps rippled across the room. Even the court stenographer paused, eyes wide. Judge Draycott, who had been eager to shove this case through the system, was now acknowledging fault. Cyrus Vane stiffened. His jaw clenched, hands balled into fists at his side. But the damage was done. The truth had been laid bare. There was no suppressing it now. Alara nearly sank to her knees. She had stood tall for so long, through every sleepless night, every rejection, every moment of hopelessness. But now relief, cold and real and overwhelming. For the first time since Cairo's arrest, she let herself believe he might be freed. Cairo's defense attorney rose quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor," he said with steel in his voice, "in light of this indisputable evidence, the defense formally requests that all charges against Cairo Monroe be dropped immediately. This young man should never have been here." The judge looked down at his bench as if it no longer belonged to him. The courtroom felt heavier now, filled with the weight of consequences. He rubbed his temple, then nodded once. "This court acknowledges the new evidence," Draycott said slowly, "and agrees that the charges should be dismissed. Cairo Monroe is hereby declared innocent." This case is dismissed with immediate effect. For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended. Then Alara collapsed, not from weakness, but from the unbearable pressure lifting at last. Her knees gave way, but she didn't hit the ground. Strong arms caught her. Cairo, her son, finally free, held her close. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched him. He had been nearly buried by a system that never saw his innocence, only his skin. And still, here he stood, whole. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "You're free, baby. I knew you'd save me, Mom," Cairo whispered back, his voice shaking with emotion. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. This wasn't a victory anyone wanted to celebrate out loud. But the energy shifted. Jurors looked down in shame. Reporters scribbled with new urgency. Even courtroom staff exchanged uncertain glances. But Cyrus Vane? Alara turned her eyes on him. His face was tight with fury. His narrowed eyes met hers with resentment, not remorse. He needed this conviction. It had been just another case to him. Another win. Another black boy destroyed to keep his record pristine. But not today. She rose, holding Cairo's hand tightly, and led him toward the exit. They walked slowly, past the stunned faces, and whispered apologies, out through the tall double doors. The corridor beyond was quiet, their footsteps echoing down the marble floor like a song of freedom. Behind them, the courtroom emptied, but Judge Lorne Draycott remained seated. He didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't call for order. He just sat there, his fingers intertwined, his gaze distant. He had seen hundreds of mothers like Alara, pleading, begging, weeping for their children. And every time, he had shut them down, dismissed their pain, treated them like noise. But Alara hadn't been noise. She had been the truth. The prosecutor had already stormed out, his career bruised. But Draycott stayed behind, alone in the silence he had helped build. He thought of past rulings, names he had forgotten, cases blurred together. But now they came back with weight. How many voices had he ignored? How many lives had he quietly erased? A chill passed through him. For the first time, the bench didn't feel powerful. It felt like a cage. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps this moment could change him. Alara Monroe's voice still echoed in his ears. Not loud, not angry, but unyielding. Justice wasn't given. It was demanded. It was fought for. It was cried for in courtrooms where no one listened, until someone did. And sometimes, the strongest evidence in the world was a mother's love. Today, Alara had been louder than the system meant to silence her.